Okay, good afternoon and welcome to the Middle East Forum's weekly podcast series, Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. My name is Anaf Kalam and I will be moderating today's discussion. We're pleased to be joined by Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, who will give us a briefing on the top events going on in Israel this week. Mr. Perry will speak for 15 minutes, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A from the audience. If you should wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I will turn our discussion over to Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Afnaf, and good evening from Israel. Well, there's really only one place to start. It's what everybody's really talking about is the Iranian threat following the attack, which was attributed to Israel. Israel hasn't confirmed it, obviously, on a building next to the Iranian diplomatic mission embassy in Syria, which killed a very senior, high-level Iranian Revolutionary Guards member, the one who pretty much was organizing and fomenting the partnership between Hezbollah and the Islamic Republic. Israel has been very much on tenterhooks ever since that moment, waiting for the Iranian response. At first, there was almost, I wouldn't say complete, but almost certainty that Iran would have to go another level to how it has reacted in the past. And there were a lot of people who felt that that would be a direct attack on Israel from Iranian territory. Obviously, that would be pretty unprecedented. I don't think that's ever happened before. Obviously, Iran has many proxies around the region, whether in Yemen, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Gaza, but they have not ever attacked Israel from Iranian territory. And there was a feeling that that could well be the first time. Israel has certainly been on extremely high level of alert. The Air Force has been training off the coast of Cyprus for long haul missions, practicing in a way that it hasn't done for a certain amount of time, a potential response to any Iranian attack. And the message that's come out from Israel openly and behind the scenes is that any attack from Iran will be met by a very strong response. And Israel has certainly drawn that red line that an attack from Iran would be qualitatively different from anything else that we've seen before. And that message perhaps has got through. There seems to be far less certainty as the week has gone on whether Iran would attack from its own territory. There are a number of options, as we know. The countries that I've mentioned before, Iran has very strong proxies with varying levels of sophisticated abilities to launch missiles. One suggestion that perhaps could well be what Iran will do is a multi-front attack from different areas, different proxies, all at the same time to try and do as much damage as possible. The next few days have been described as crucial. These things could happen at any moment. And what we've seen is also an important response, I would say, from the US. First of all, we have CENTCOM General Michael Kurilla in the country meeting with Israel's chief of staff, Israel's defense minister, and the sort of, I would say, warm embrace, full throated support that he has given and other American senior leaders have given on the Iranian issue has been extremely welcome here. Defense Minister Gallant has been in touch with his counterpart, Defense Secretary Austin, almost daily, if not multiple times daily. The message from Israel is that Israel would like to see something more forceful coming out of the US, because it's clear that the more US threaten that they will join in any attack against Iran, if Iran should attack from its own territory, the more that Iran stands down. And we've certainly seen that, as I've said, they have seemingly, again, it's not certain, we don't know, but seemingly backtracked. They've even said that if there was a forceful UN Security Council resolution against Israel for the attack in Damascus, then they wouldn't have a need for a respond. But in the highest levels, the Ayatollahs have come out very, very strong language that hasn't really been used before. So there is an expectation that there will be some response. We've also heard a very sort of different language, perhaps reminiscent of the days after October 7th, coming straight from the Biden administration and President Biden himself. He's been very strong when it comes to Iran, standing alongside his Japanese counterpart today. He reiterated that the US commitment to Israel's security in the face of Iranian threat is ironclad, and he used that word ironclad at least a few times during his speech to make it clear this is something that the Israelis certainly would like to see. The UK, Rishi Sunak, Prime Minister Sunak, also talked about his support for Israel if in the face of Iranian threats. So the question that a lot of Israelis are having, why the difference of tone on this issue as opposed to what we've seen recently on the issue surrounding Gaza and Hamas? Well, firstly, the issue surrounding Gaza and Hamas has largely been led by the State Department, by Secretary Blinken, where we know that they take a more tough approach towards Israel. They look at the regional, what's going on in the region, and they listen to some of the players, and they try and push back against Israel and what it's doing, and the increased bloodshed amongst Palestinians. I'm not going to get into the numbers and everything out, but it's clear that Palestinians are dying. These have been seen on Al Jazeera screens around the region and around the world, and this is certainly causing a lot of disquiet within the State Department. The Iranian threat, is one that's being led by the defense community in the US, by the Army, the US Army figures, and as I said, Defense Secretary Austin. And these are figures who understand war, they understand the Iranian threat, but most importantly, they understand what Israel has done in the Central Command in recent years, the invaluable intelligence information that Israel is constantly providing its allies, chiefly the US, that really does save US lives. So there is a very different slant depending what the approach is and where it's coming from in the US. But that's certainly something which a lot of people have picked up on, and they've questioned why the language, the rhetoric that's coming out of the US is markedly different on the Iranian threat. And also simply the Americans understand the threat there. And also, let's not forget that they are hearing from their other allies, whether it's Saudi Arabia, the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, and they are as worried about Iran as Israel is. And behind closed doors, they will be saying that they will do everything possible to a point to help should Iran attack. But obviously, we've got to be very cautious with this, but certainly they wouldn't join in, let's say, on the other side. But the effect that the Iranian threat is happening also in the Gaza theater is also not insignificant. Firstly, there is a feeling that Yahya Sinwar, the Hamas leader in Gaza, the one who seems to be running the show, formally, leading Hamas's fight in the Gaza Strip, but certainly the one who seemingly is making the decisions about the hostages, chiefly because he's probably the one who is holding the keys. But there is a feeling now with Iran's threat, he's taking very much a wait and see, a careful approach, because what he's hoping for certainly is some sort of wider regional war that would involve an Iranian strike on Israel, an Israel strike back on Iran, the proxies joining in from all the different quarters in a far more vociferous way, especially Hezbollah. Hamas have been extremely disappointed in the response from Hezbollah. They expected Hezbollah to come in more forcefully to distract and detract the Israeli army in a more forceful way. That simply hasn't happened. So Sinwar is waiting to see what the Iranian response will be. Obviously, if it's not something significant, then that could further dampen his expectations. Obviously, if there is something more significant and it does get a little bit out of hand, that will certainly play into Sinwar's hands. And we're seeing that very much with the hostage negotiations. Hamas are not coming down at this point. They keep on walking away from the negotiations and then coming back. Quite simply, there doesn't seem to be too much progress on the hostage negotiations at this moment. And there's a lot of speculation. It's because Sinwar is simply waiting for the Ayatollahs. Obviously, there's been reports this week that another reason perhaps the hostage negotiations haven't progressed is because Hamas simply don't have the 40 hostages which are necessary for the first part of the deal. For a number of months now, we've understood the parameters of the deal would involve, at the first stage at least, the release of 40 hostages in the categories of younger women, the elderly, those who are severely injured, etc. It would leave out men of fighting age and soldiers, both men and women. But it would seem that, again, according to reports, I have no specific knowledge of that, that Hamas simply do not have the requisite 40. They've offered to give 40 hostages dead and alive, and that's what's caused a large amount of disquiet amongst the Israeli hostages and in Israel, that if they do not have 40 in that category, then perhaps there's a lot more hostages who are no longer with us than we originally suspected. In fact, some US intelligence agencies have actually stated that they believe that the majority of hostages at this point are no longer with us. But again, these are just reports. This is to a certain extent based on intelligence, but also to a certain extent based on conjecture. That on the ground, as we spoke last week, Israel has removed all of its units from Gaza, apart from the Nahal unit, which is basically holding the middle of Gaza, making sure people do not move from the north to the south and the south to the north. But it has moved to a targeted operational basis where it's really trying to flush out some of the last pockets of Hamas resistance in the center, specifically around 3 or 4 refugee camps that Israel hasn't really dealt with too much up until this point. They were not considered priority as Israel moved from north to south, but now it's mopping these up, partly because it simply still has not decided whether to go into Rafah. Prime Minister Netanyahu repeatedly says that Israel will eventually go into Rafah, but there seems to be no indications of that at this point. One major event this week, in fact, I think it happened yesterday, if I'm not much mistaken, was 3 sons and some grandchildren of Ismail Haniyeh, the leader of Hamas abroad, were killed in a military strike by the IDF. The IDF said that all 3 sons were involved with Hamas's military, and they were involved in terrorist attacks and even in planning more attacks in the future. So Israel took this, I wouldn't say unusual, because Ismail Haniyeh's brother was targeted in the early days of the war, and other members of his family and other members of families of high-ranking Hamas officials. But certainly this was quite a large event, that 3 sons and some grandchildren were all killed in one strike. There's a debate in Israel exactly who knew what. Some say that it was just an IDF decision on the ground. They saw an opportunity. Perhaps they saw that they were planning a terrorist attack as being suggested, and they decided to take that opportunity. There are those who suggest that the political level did not know specifically about that strike and did not greenlight it in advance. And there is a certain concern amongst some that could torpedo the negotiations. Haniyeh himself put on a brave face, very much the show for the cameras, and said that this will not have any effect, and even on the negotiations, and even blessed himself and his family that they were honored with martyrs, and tried to, as I said, put on a brave face and show how happy he was that his family become martyrs to the cause. A new line that's coming out very much from the government, from the Prime Minister's office, about the lack of entry into Rafah is that this is not his decision. He's being overruled, or he's being swayed, or he's not being given options by the Chief of Staff, Herzi Halevi. And that's been very much led by Gantz and Eisenkot. And they're the ones who are pretty much deciding this. It's a debatable line, because Herzi Halevi has said very many times that we're ready to go into Rafah. We just need to get the command from above. But it's going to probably grow in the days ahead, when there seems to be so much pressure within Israel to finish off Hamas, and that would mean going into Rafah. And so there's going to be a bit of a deflection. There's going to be a bit of a blame game at this point. So we'll have to see how that plays itself out. Finally, the big issue internationally, at least, is the issue of aid, especially after the mistaken killing of the 7 aid workers. The international community has been very strong in trying to provide as much aid as possible. 500 trucks a day is what they're aiming for. And Israel in the last week has provided more humanitarian aid than it has since the beginning of the war, and even before the war. There's been a bit of a discrepancy between what the IDF claims and what the UN says. There's a bit of a debate about that, but it's clear that Israel has upped the ante as far as flooding, as to use Defense Minister Gallant's term, the strip with aid. There are those who feel that this is a mistake and this is giving Hamas exactly what they need. There's going to be no anger amongst the people. No one's going to be in any, Hamas are going to have everything that they need. And there's a large amount of disquiet. And what we've seen tonight for the first time, and with that I'll move to questions, is a right-wing demonstration outside Prime Minister Netanyahu's house, led by one of the more right-wing hostage families groups, but also other NGOs, right-wing NGOs, who are basically calling on Prime Minister to stop the aid, to go into Rafah, because they say the only way to win this war, the only way to bring the hostages home, is with military pressure. And that's something which the Prime Minister has mentioned many, many times. So they're using his own language against him. But this is also causing a lot of disquiet amongst the more right-wing elements of the government, whether it's Itamar Ben-Gvir or Bezalel Smotrich, who have said that they will certainly have to rethink their place in the government if Israel takes its foot off the gas, if Israel doesn't go to Rafah. Interestingly enough, they have not set a date for it. So it seems to be an empty threat, because they could be sitting there for weeks or months. But it's certainly an issue which is concerning for the right wing. And we now see the start of a significant protest against the Prime Minister, not from the left, as we've had for many months, but now from the right. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much for that brief, Ashley. That last point was actually a very good segue into a question that is coming in from Edward Lipson, who asks, prominent supporters of Israel in the US and elsewhere, including Brett Stevens from the New York Times, are now calling for Netanyahu's departure one way or another. To what extent does that mirror the Israeli public opinion?
Not much. I'll be honest. Israeli public opinion is not so swayed by outside voices calling for the dismissal or prime minister or early elections. In fact, sometimes it plays into very much Netanyahu's camp. When Chuck Schumer called for his, for him to resign or call for elections, that actually played quite well into Netanyahu's base and potential base, because he actually rose a little bit, not a large amount, but a little bit in the polls. There is a feeling amongst most Israelis, I would say, that Israel doesn't want outside forces intervening in domestic politics. I would say that 95% of the people in Israel don't know who Brett Stevens is, so that probably doesn't have the biggest effect. But obviously, his polling numbers are far greater concern to Netanyahu than any outside voices, and they're still pretty low, although they have, as I said, stabilized and even improved in recent weeks. And those who want Netanyahu gone abroad are actually probably more playing into his hands by calling for his departure than if they actually kept quiet.
Oh, thank you. Now, moving on to the actual military operations, we have a question from Jack Wasserman, who asks, why is there such a delay in entering and cleaning Hamas out of Rafah?
I mean, my view is simply that it's the international backlash. There are those who claim that Israel doesn't want to go in while there's a chance of hostage negotiations because they don't want to go in and then stop and then have to go out mid-operation. I don't buy that. A lot of people are not buying that. So it's clear that it's international pressure. International pressure also, I believe, led to the removal of almost all Israeli forces currently from Gaza. As I said, it is still conducting operations by air, and at night they do have some targeted operations, but it's simply down to international pressure. There is, as I've said, there's not a green light, there's not an amber light, there's a red light at the moment from the US about going into Rafah. There are discussions that seem between the Israeli and the American counterparts over what an operation in Rafah would look like. And as of now, the Americans are saying that they have not seen a feasible or realistic plan to go into Rafah, but most importantly for them to be able to remove the civilians from all over the strip who have made their way there, which is now well over 1.5 million. For the Americans to even get close to green lighting such an operation, they would need to see a plan. Israel bought 40,000 tents this week. With that in mind, it's obviously not enough for 1.5 million people, but it's clear that there are major differences between the Biden administration and the Netanyahu government on this. And at the moment, they do not seem to be bridged. I don't see the Israeli government going into Rafah without, or with, let's say, in the face of an American red light, let alone all the other countries around the world. But obviously the US is the most important when it comes to these things. So I think that's really, to my mind, what the main reason is.
All right, thank you. Now, we have a question from BK. You may or may not be able to answer this, but they ask, what would be the role of the Kiretik base in case of an Iranian attack against Israel? Could Israel depend on a base in Turkey while interstate relations between Turkey and the Jewish state are shaky?
Which base? There's a base in Turkey. How would that? I don't understand how that would play into Israel's. I don't think it would need to go to any base in Turkey, and I do not see any situation Turkey would give any assistance to Israel. So I'm not quite sure how to answer that question, if I'm honest.
No problem. Now we're getting a few more in here. We have a question from Amalia who asks, why isn't evidence presented that Gazans are not starving, as this seems to be the major reason for the ceasefire demand?
Well, it's simply, how, the old adage, how do you prove you don't have a sister? It's very difficult to prove something isn't as opposed to proving something is. The Hamas propaganda machine is putting out that there's starvation, there's famine, and all they have to do is show a few kids who look, whatever. In fact, some of the pictures that have been released in recent days are actually of Gazan kids who are suffering from cancer, or even some pictures of children in Syria. But the fact is that the international organizations are very much also playing into this narrative. Obviously, a lot of them don't have a presence on the ground. So much of it, not all of it, but much of their information is being fed by Hamas because they're the only officials in Gaza at the moment. It's very hard for Israel to say. I mean, Israel has said that there is no famine, there is no widespread hunger. Situation is not nice, of course. Israel understands that, but there is no famine, no hunger, and certainly with the new upping of humanitarian aid coming in every day, that's going to be alleviated even further. But it's simply, Israel says there is no hunger, but many international organizations and Hamas themselves are saying there is hunger and famine, and so it's just a matter of who people believe. But as we've seen, if a UN organization or an international NGO comes out and says that there is hunger, and the Israeli army says, or the Israeli government says there isn't, it's very hard to dissuade people otherwise.
All right, thank you. Now, I understand you touched on this for some time in your presentation earlier, but we have quite a few questions asking about the hostages in Gaza. And I will kind of sum them up with a question from Ernie, who asks more personally, do you think, in your view, that the hostages are alive? And is that why it seems that Hamas can't deliver the 40 or so remaining hostages that are being demanded?
I mean, I have no inside knowledge, so I really can't say. I'm just trying to give the information, explain what has been put out there. As I said, the Americans are of the view that even the majority may no longer be with us. Maybe that they've suggested some were killed in Israeli airstrikes, some were killed by Hamas, Islamic Jihad, or others. Some just died of their wounds. We know, quite a few were injured, some severely injured when they were kidnapped. But it does seem that Hamas, again, just from reports, that it does not have the minimum amount to even start the first phase of hostage negotiations. It could be a tactic. We've heard in the past Hamas have said a particular hostage was dead, and then they showed up on one of the releases during the last sort of pause in fighting when dozens of Israeli hostages were released. So it could be a play for time, but it could also be accurate that simply they do not have the numbers that people thought. But it's really impossible to know at this point because Hamas are not giving any details whatsoever.
Okay, thank you. Now, we have a question from Fred, who asks, in the proverbial day after the hostilities in Gaza, what are the plans to govern Gaza and begin to re-educate the people of Gaza?
That's the big question. Israel still hasn't put out a day after plan. There were some reports that a couple of months ago there was a suggestion of Palestinian Authority coming in, backed by the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, maybe the Qataris. We're not sure exactly what that would look like if they would send forces in themselves, but it was something of a non-starter for Israel. As we know, Israel has a pretty right-wing government, and even if it wasn't a right-wing government, there's certainly a lot of suspicion about the Palestinian Authority, about its role, whether it's markedly different from Hamas. Certainly on the issue of education, it's certainly no better. So if they did allow the Palestinian Authority, if they didn't pay special attention to the radicalism, to the extremism, to the incitement, then we'll just be back to where we were before. But Israeli officials are remaining pretty tight-lipped on what happens the day after. The answer given when they are asked about it, they said, well, we can't know what the day after looks like if we don't know yet what the day before will look like. In other words, how the war ends. Are they able to, as they promised, to completely demolish Hamas? And then if they're able to, that's a different scenario too, if they still haven't finished certain pockets. So that's the excuse, let's say, quote unquote, that Israeli government officials give for the day after. But at the moment, Israel hasn't presented its own plan.
All right, thank you. I think we have time for one more here. It comes from an anonymous attendee who asks, how is the Gaza pier construction going? Are there any new shipments from Cyprus?
So apparently Cyprus is now getting a little bit bogged down in the aid because ever since the humanitarian aid workers were killed, a lot of the aid organizations have left. They want to see a response from Israel. In fact, Israel this week, in fact, even I think today, met with many of these aid organizations to show them what they're doing to try and to ensure as much as possible that that will not be repeated, and Israel's doing as much as possible to bring aid in to work with these organizations. But at the moment, they haven't returned. So Cyprus has basically got a lot of aid. It's waiting for the organizations to come back into Gaza, and then they'll be able to send a lot more shipments through the sea to Gaza.
All right. Well, thank you, Ashley. Unfortunately, we have come to the end of our podcast. We thank you again, Ashley, for giving us the update this week.
Thank you.
And for our viewers and listeners, please be on the lookout for our weekly podcast offerings email coming out over the weekend. And once again, we would like to remind you all of our upcoming policy conference celebrating the 30-year anniversary of the Middle East Forum. It'll be taking place from May 13th through May 15th in Washington, D.C., and it'll feature policy panels covering Israel victory, Turkey, Qatar, Iran, Islamism, and much, much more. You could sign up on our website under the activities tab. We hope to see you all there. We thank you all for joining us today, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Thanks.